The topic that we're gonna conclude with is around what we can call abstraction and language. So there is one question that in a way resumes this, which is how does abstraction help us to understand the universe, and how can we form new languages when standard forms fail? So I would like first to introduce briefly my panel, and I think that would be great if each of you introduce yourself. I mean, Monica is already, yes, introduced. So, and it's great that we are also concluding the panel with Monica here. I think, yeah.
I'm Haroon Mirza, and I'm an artist, and I work with Jack here on one of the installations.
And I'm Jack, and I'm an artist, and I work with Haroon here on one of the installations.
I'll go with formation. I'm Diane Bauer. Is this working? And I work with Seth on something upstairs.
Should we complete the symmetry?
It's like a Mexican wave.
Mexican
Break
wave
the symmetry. I'll break the symmetry. Okay, so I'm Seth, and I'm working with Diane. I don't.
And these two on the end work together. So
Yes. Yes.
create a circle or something.
Super symmetry does exist.
Recession.
So here there are two topics, abstraction and language, that in many ways cross paths, and it would be tricky, of course, to talk about that extensively in 30 minutes or 45 minutes, but I would like to give a very brief overview, not only of the works of Diane and Seth and Haroon and Jack, but also to give a little bit of an overview of other works that have a little bit to do with language, because this is a recurring topic, but it has been discussed and interpreted by the artists in the show in many ways. And I would like to start a little bit with a work that is in the foyer, the work of Julieta Aranda, which is called Stealing One's Own Corpse, an alternative set of footholds for an ascent into the dark. And this is a last part of a trilogy in which she is investigating the contemporary existential conditions underlining extra-scientific circumstances that prevail around scientific and technological research. And here, Julieta focuses on the current state of humanism, but turning it into a more individualistic, human-centered perspective, extending it to exploitations and extractions through land and soil. And in the installation, if you go there, you will see 3 large prints of a gene. And while we were talking with Julieta some days ago, while we were mounting the exhibition, we came to knew that this was the gene of something called FOXP2, which may seem to be one of the genes that make it easier for human beings to transform new experiences into routine procedures. So it seems that, at least from what neuroscientists have found out, this gene mutation, which arose from more than 500,000 years ago, may be key to humans' unique ability to traduce and understand language, thus transforming experiences into hearing, let's say, for example, a word pen, and when we are shown a pen, it gets into a nearly automatic association of that word to the associated object and its functions. So speaking about speaking and language may have something to do also with a special kind of learning, which takes us from having to make conscious associations in order to act to a nearly automatic or automatic pilot way. Of course, mind, language, and reality are deeply interconnected, and there's been several intellectuals and philosophers that have studied this, and also several scientists, from Nelson Goodman, Willem Flusser, that provide an approach to a theory of symbols using text, images, scores, both as language but also as semantic signifiers. Or, for example, Walter Ong, who has also studied the relation between orality, literacy, and technology. So in a way, writing, which is a sophisticated version of language, has been the main way of human communication for the last 6,000 years, including the way in which computers today support many of its processes. In the case of the work of Haroon and Jack, which also examine language, here it's interesting because I think that when we are talking about language, we describe also this fundamental way in which within physics we use mathematics. And here, maybe it's interesting. I was talking with a friend right now some minutes ago, and in a way it becomes a bit of an epistemological paradox when we talk about mathematics. And there are a couple of interesting quotes, one from Einstein, where he said how, and I'm just quoting him, how can it be that mathematics, being, after all, a product of human thought, which is independent of experience, is so admirably appropriate to the objects of reality? And this epistemological paradox between mathematics and other disciplines becomes even strikingly more vivid in the words of Richard Feynman, with which he was concerned about a remarkable relationship between mathematics and physics, and said, mathematics is not a science from our point of view, in the sense that it is not a natural science. The test of its validity is not an experiment. So, in a way, we know on the fundamental laws of the universe, as the ones that are being studied at Cern, the less the real world makes sense, the less the real world makes sense to us in a way, because of all these ways in which mathematics and other types of languages are used. And in a way, sometimes we may say, and it's in the case of the work of Haroon and Jack, it's a kind of nonsense if we took it from a different stance. For example, if we take it 2,000 years from now. So these are very interesting aspects. Even in the case of the work of Yuchen Wang, for example, she also, in one of the layers of her work, when she uses sound, in a moment she reads on a scientific paper, and once more, when you read a scientific paper itself, it's already nonsense, because many scientific papers are not meant to be spoken. They require another type of reading, perhaps reading them by sitting next to the paper and reproducing some of the theories that may prove to be valid or not. In the case, for example, of Susan Treister, also in the second floor, it's interesting when she spots the interviews with the scientists, and there is a type of language that the scientists use in order to explain a theory. But whenever they go into the realm of the image, it's a completely different type of explanation. So once more, this has to do, and as I was saying before, Nelson Goodman has studied this a lot. There are all these different symbolic elements depending on the type of symbolic use. Either it's image, either it's a text, or scores, or sounds, or codifications. Then I want to move a little bit to the space, to jump a little bit to the world of abstraction, and in particular to the work of Diane, who also uses scientific theory of space and time in order to produce questions in a way as a sort of a manifesto in which she's urging for humans to gain a better glimpse of abstraction as means to understand the impact of certain scientific phenomena in the world. And this is even more acute, and I want to finish there with the work of Leah Porsager, who uses spiritualism as an attempt to practice metaphysics through scientific means and to prove the existence of a world beyond. So I want to I have some very specific questions that perhaps could generate a little bit of a discussion here. The first is for Haroon. Haroon, you mentioned once while we were talking about your readings on McLuhan, in particular his book, The Mechanical Bride, who was also, you were also quite fascinated about the subject, and that McLuhan popularized the idea of language being a technology or an extension of man. That essentially separates how reality is perceived into the distinct senses of seeing and hearing. Can you tell us a bit more about this and how it is impregnated in your work, in the piece that you presented with Jack?
Yeah, sure. It's funny that you bring up The Mechanical Bride, actually, because is this working? Yeah. Because oh right, well, the guy that actually handed me that book 20 years ago sat in the audience, Nathan. In Winchester, I was about to embark on writing my dissertation, I guess, and he gave me a bunch of books, and that was one of them, along with Baudrillard and some other stuff. I can't remember if you remember, Nathan, what you gave me. But I think the thing that I took out of McLuhan, because I was interested in acoustic space, particularly his essay on, that's the thing that really I gravitated towards. And he saw acoustic space as, he was talking about media, obviously. He was talking about media technologies and how they disseminate throughout the world and how people perceive them. So there was two sides of it. One was just the pragmatics of acoustic space and how acoustic space differs from visual space. But the other was this sort of deeper philosophical side of acoustic space and language, and how language is an acoustic, it was an acoustic thing in the first place before Gutenberg, before the Mechanical Bride, which is what he's talking about which is the reference, is Gutenberg and the printed text. He talks about how visual space and acoustic space separate. So as soon as, like you were saying about the pen, you say the word pen, and as soon as you say that word, you know what that instrument is. You think of a pen. So before that moment, there was just the object, the pen, and the experience of the object was both acoustic and visual simultaneously. And with language, there was a sort of a bifurcation. It's split, and that's when acoustic space and visual space somehow separated in terms of perception. So that's what he argues, basically, with this essay, or a number of essays that he wrote about visual and acoustic space. And I guess that was my sort of main interest. There's a lot of other parts of McLuhan that I find sort of interesting that are probably irrelevant to this piece as well. But I think that's the main thing, really. This kind of, and then he talks about with printed, with Gutenberg, you then have another separation. So, so the word pen is not the thing itself. It's an abstraction. It's a phonetic. It's an acoustic abstraction of the thing. So it's a representation of this thing that you can experience, and the sound pen isn't the thing itself. It's a representation. So that's one level of abstraction. But then when you write the word pen with syntax, that's bringing it back into visual space. A graphic into graphic form. Which is an abstraction of the sound. I mean, this is only in the West. It's not in the East where they have, where there's characters. So that's slightly different. But you have two levels of abstraction from the thing itself, and I think somehow in this sort of more contemporary situation where so because of this, perhaps the visual became more important somehow. So we became an ocular-centric society in the West. And because of what's happening now with media and how media is transformed, and it's become more than just things that we see, there's a sort of, there's more of a balance in terms of the visual and acoustic. And that's the thing that interests me.
So you are trying to integrate back
Well, I mean,
those
within my work, I
sensorial
guess.
inputs,
Yeah, I guess within what I've been doing for the last 20 years, I guess, is this kind of thinking about perception as a not just these separate things dependent on certain parts of the physiology, but more of a whole.
Jack, there are 4 distinct texts present in the piece, 1-to-1. One is spoken by Jess.
1-1-1.
The 1-on-1.
121 is an old mobile phone company from the 90s.
Yes, 1-1-1. Yeah.
1.
111.
Yeah. One is the spoken by Jess, the other one by the avatar, and the 2 that appear as writing at the top.
Yeah.
But each was produced with a combination of conventional authoring and algorithmic processes. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? Because obviously, when we get there and we try to, the first time that you sent me the video, I was trying to understand something, and I was feeling that either I was stupid or there was something that was a mistake, that I couldn't make sense of anything, and then you explained me with a lot of detail about this. But if you can explain us also, I mean, not just the processes, but why did you came across this type
the
of
rationale.
Yeah, the rationale of that language.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, you should kind of know that the basic structure, the kind of physical setup of this piece is it's got eight channels of electrical signals, which are going to 8 speakers, and also going to 8 strips of LEDs, which is something that Haroon uses a lot in his practice. And there's also a single video screen. So the text that you're referring to is on the video. So yeah, there's 4 distinct texts. So 2 of them are being spoken. One of them is being spoken by our friend Jess, who's a human, so she's just a real person. There's also a CGI avatar who is it's an avatar of Jess that we made with some free software. She's speaking another text, and her voice is actually from a Google kind of speech synthesizer. And then there's 2. Sort of a 3rd and a 4th text that appear as subtitles, but they kind of behave, at least at the beginning, like subtitles, and that they're kind of synchronized to what's being spoken, but they're different words. And the way that they were produced, so there was a mixture, like you said, Jose Carlos, of conventional kind of authoring, and then at certain points they got kind of mangled by various kind of algorithms, so sort of various simple. I'll just explain it. So the first text was something that I wrote that was kind of based on some ideas that we had at Cern about archaeology and sort of digging down through the kind of surface kind of level of reality, and also just literally digging into the ground and finding old bits of kind of
bins.
Yeah, going through the bins, which is what we did a lot at Cern. We kind of went through there. They've got the best bins in the world if you're into like kind of old bits of circuit board and stuff. So, and I then got that text. It was just a bit of a kind of poem, and then I just repeatedly Google translated it till it had kind of become sort of like concrete poetry, really. It became really interesting. Slightly nonsensical, but kind of evocative, because it had come from source material. It wasn't nonsense to begin with. Then the other spoken text that the avatar's reading was made by. I made a list of about 300 words that were just random words that I liked that just kind of came up spontaneously. It was just kind of like bridge, sail, because just this big list. And then with each of those words, I used them as the first word. I basically typed them into my phone and then used the predictive text on my phone, going in a certain kind of pattern of its suggestions, so I wasn't kind of able to influence it to make it say things that I liked. That produced 300 10-word sentences, and I then went through and selectively picked the ones that I liked and arranged them so that they had the kind of structure of a magical invocation, basically. So they're sort of like I had in mind your higher self or your kind of holy guardian angel or something, sort of contacting you, or a kind of very futuristic human trying to contact us back in the past. But because it was done by my phone, it keeps descending into kind of talking about email and sort of saying, yeah, best regards and things. And then the other two texts, so the subtitle text, one of them was a poem that, again, I just Google translated, and it just appears on the screen kind of verbatim. And then the fourth one is the first two chapters of the Tao Te Ching, which is the Chinese book of Taoism. So, you know, this is kind of yin and yang, the kind of whole Chinese ancient philosophy. And the first two chapters of it deal specifically with the relationship between language and the world. So the very first line of it is, the Tao that can be expressed is not the eternal Tao. So it's immediately pointing at the kind of the limitations that there are of language. And I got that, and I got the Google speech-to-text app on my phone and just read it really fast, so it couldn't keep up. And so it just completely garbled it. But again, in a kind of way that felt quite nice and poetic. So those are the texts. And I guess part of the rationale for doing it was that, you know, I think generally when doing art, at least the kind of work that I've been doing with Haroon, it's kind of nice to just not have too much of a controlling hand on what's going on and be open to just accidents and chance and things that sort of, you know, undercut your original idea, but in a way that kind of makes it more interesting. So that was kind of that was the sort of initial, just instinctive reason for doing it. But in fact, there is, you know, Haroon and I this work has come out of a long conversation that was going on a long time before we went to Cern around questions of consciousness and the relationship between conscious experience and physical reality, kind of matter. And there's something interesting about these really stupid Google algorithms, because they are sort of, you know, they may not be conscious in the way that we are, but they do have a kind of type of intelligence, and the realm that they inhabit is this purely kind of cyberspace type realm. So one of the things that we did and didn't end up using in the end was we got an online article generator, so something that writes news articles, and got it to write an article on quantum gravity. And it basically, if you didn't know physics, you'd just think, this is a physics paper, and it's just, I mean, it's gibberish, but it's really good physics gibberish. And but that was the only things that it had to refer to, that online generator, is it just does a search on the internet and finds things, and assimilates it. So that, you know, it's living in this realm where all of its kind of sensory inputs are totally virtual. And so it kind of, you know, it's a nice way of thinking about the relationship between matter. You know, all these things are just running on digital, you know, hardware somewhere. They're totally material, and yet they're kind of abstract at the same time. So it was a nice way of tying these things together.
Diane, moving on to your work, your work is in a way based on discussions of notions of space and time, and how our immediate reality is completely exotic from today's fundamental science. But you use a lot of graphics and animations and also text. And I was wondering how these different notations in your work work as a common result. Also, in connection afterwards with sound, and that's something more specific. Also, perhaps Seth can also mention something around this way in which music is produced and operates. We were talking some minutes ago with Seth about how music could become a sort of a psychoactive change or activator.
Well, the question is sort of why the shapes, or what's the importance of abstraction?
I mean,
because they're quite different. They're very different lines. I mean, one is like a formalism, and it, in a way, is sort of less meaty, I suppose, than the question of abstraction more broadly. I don't know.
I mean,
either.
Whatever you, I mean, what is interesting, I think, is the combination of all these different types of graphics and texts to generate this type of perception of vertigo, or I mean, that it's consolidated within also the sound. because basically that's an abstraction. I mean, you're using formal notations in order to produce an abstraction.
I suppose. I mean, I think my interest in abstraction is. I mean, it's sort of at the heart of all the work done at CERN. It's at the heart of. I mean, we wouldn't sort of be where we are as a species without it. I mean, that's sort of. I suppose my interest in it, and I think with the video specifically, having. I have an interest in sort of pushing the capacities of what the human can do. So I mean, it's a very small example of sort of giving you too much information at once. So I mean, that's sort of the experience of the visual within it, and I suppose the audio as well. Actually, is more than you can sort of take at once. I mean, but my interest in abstraction is sort of beyond that, really. I mean, I'm quite interested in I suppose the limits of the human
Perception.
Well, yes, perception, but not just. I mean, I suppose recognizing that our limits of perception are very are slim, and that we exist in a very specific scale that feels like reality, but actually there's these other scales that happen that are completely inaccessible to us on a daily basis, but fundamentally make up the world that we live in. And you know, it's funny. A question came up earlier around CERN and I understood it to be vaguely about climate and the future, and how does CERN sort of deal with that. And I think one of the things I'm interested in, particularly around this, is our capacity, the capacity that we have as a species to understand the extremes of scale that we can now is relatively recent. You know, it's only a couple hundred years that we've sort of had access to this stuff, even as ideas, and I think, or my hope, I suppose, is that this is an instigation of a grand demotion of us as a species, and I think CERN can contribute to that because it sort of normalizes this ability to this capacity to access things that are outside of experience. Sort of, I'm quite interested in this difference between being able to know something not through experience. So you experience one thing and you know another, but both things exist at the same time. Mm-hmm. And I think the video does this, but I think it's sort of it's a bit of a rabbit hole.
So many threads to this conversation. I'm just trying to organise my thinking a little bit. Just to respond, I mean, this idea of scale and this question between auditory and visual channels, probably worth unpicking a little bit, because Dan and I had a lot of conversations about the privileging, the historic privileging of the visual, which Jonathan Stern talks about in relation to back to Aristotle, etc. You know, seeing is believing, etc. And I have a certain kind of polemical stance against that, as you might not be surprised as a sound artist, but also as someone whose background is in neurosciences. So, and this question of language. So I think what the shared understanding, I think, that Diane and I were talking about was almost a triadic relationship between the auditory, the visual, and the conceptual, and not, you know, the conceptual operating through both the visual graphic structures that Diane develops, but also sound and these questions of scale. So I think the particular thing, at least from my end, that I was interested in was the way in which a single pattern can operate over different time frames simultaneously. So and the limits that, or the way that pushes at the perceptual categorical limits that we you know, phenomenally perceive. So there's something, for example, about how a single pattern presented over microseconds, you know, is perceived as a click, even though within a single click that you'll hear here, there's a huge amount of detail, but it's just beyond what can be heard. You take the same pattern, you apply it over seconds, and you start hearing spatialized, maybe bass sounds, and you apply it over a millennia, and maybe we get to a black hole or something. I don't know, the great B flat of the universe, or wherever we're at with that. But these questions of scale and these questions of limit, of human limit, and the way that these operate, I think is very interesting. I think is probably fundamental, I think, to the work.
It's a part of our limitation, though, isn't it? Human limitation. That's the resolution that we can see. That's the resolution that we can hear. It's about the scale. You know, you're talking about what we can. We can look into different scales, but it's not really part of our everyday.
But it's not outside of our capacity. I guess
It's not outside of our capacity to
I mean,
observe.
that's the thing that interests me, is that we do have this capacity for abstraction, you know, and it's exemplified by, I mean, fantastically well through science, but through art as well.
Let me just pick up on this earlier question about sort of art science, because I think maybe that's part of what we're thinking about. It's something that there's a science historian, a microbiologist called Hans-Jörg Reinberger, who talks about both being concerned with the generation of new epistemic things. So there's a kind of experimental method by which both arts and science can be concerned with the generation of new knowledge in different ways. But particularly, you know, the assembling of materials, the assembling of processes, harnessing them to try and push at the limits that we were hearing about earlier in a variety of ways, or coming at it from a variety of different perspectives, which I think is probably opens up a more speculative stance towards, you know, what might be possible in terms of work, but also in terms of what scientists are thinking about. So I think there are lots of commonalities there.
I mean, I do think that some of the descriptions earlier of scientific practice feels exactly like studio practice, you know, and sort of having a hunch and following it and ending up potentially somewhere other than you originally intended. I mean, I think in this piece it very much started about thinking about the difference between temporality and time. So time as it exists in physics, and that it can go in either direction, and that's perfectly fine and doesn't violate anything, but it's so contrary to the experience of temporality as unidirectional and this sort of thing. And while that is still very much in there, by the time the piece came together, it ends up being introducing ideas of like, well, maybe like the meat we're in just doesn't have the capacity to understand time. We're not up to it. I mean, time is exemplary of a lot of other things. I mean, we just don't have the capacity as a species to fully understand what the actual fabric of the universe is. We have limits, but potentially collaborations with machines. So not just machines like Cern, like the LHC, but artificial intelligence, and perhaps through these sort of collaborations, we might be able to develop a more adequate, or more adequate capacities to understand how time actually functions, because we're so it's so our understanding of reality can be very determined by our experience, and it's very, very hard to get out of the notion that time flows.
Monica, I just want to conclude asking you something that I always in a way admire you for that, but it's also a challenge. I mean, when you get a proposal from or you get a series of proposals from the artists that would like to apply to Cern, I mean, there's always an abstract language in what they propose, and you have to, in a way, translate that into, okay, they will meet with these artists, with these scientists, with these other scientists. So in a way, it's also an effort of translating from one type of abstraction to something that it's more closer to the different practices at Cern. How challenging has this been? Because it's a constant curatorial job within the lab.
Yeah, that's a very nice question, actually. Because I keep thinking myself about how to improve it and enhance the way we do it. But, you know, listening to you, I was thinking about these sailors, the colonizers of the hidden walls when the oceans were not connected and people had to navigate to terra incognita and find the Cabo Hornos and cross from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And they were scared to just fall from the world to an unknown place. I think sometimes we need to set ourselves this challenge, right? And I think we try to do it. When I have a proposal, and I know many people knows many things that we can share from both sides, the people who come and the people who stays there for 20 years, but also the people who come for 3 days, they have an intuition and a way to phrase and try to imagine this unknown place that they want to feel with some experience and knowledge. So my only reaction to that is that can we provide this structure to where each person's skill can negotiate and can feel with experiences that might be unique. We have so much to offer, and sometimes I see myself with this bad habit of going to exhibitions and thinking, what can we offer to this artist at Cern? And there are many things that I keep thinking, yeah, we could add this layer to it, because there are many layers. We are just naming a few: complexity, precision. Language is a continuous framework for discovery. But yeah, maybe we need to. I keep thinking that there are many Cerns. We, as curators, keep looking for models of providing opportunities for new artistic practices. So yeah. You just need to react with your own expertise and how you can negotiate it, right? How you can sail through these places and without getting too scared. The other day, Leslie Thornton, an artist who I'm working with at Cern, she said that by coming to these environments, she realized her position as artist, as someone who is looking for new spaces for research, abstract spaces that you need to look for every day as an artist, because you are investigating the boundaries. And I thought it was really nice. And then she added that while she is 68, around 68, I didn't ask, but I think she's about this generation. And she said, you know, when I was in art school and later, we kept talking to each other, the artists, we were a community. And now we are just sailors. We are looking for these spaces. So I think it's, yeah, we just need to make the service.
Okay, any questions for our panel? Really?
That's good.
It's getting late in the day.
I wanted a bit of time to sort of have a little think there. It's about meaning, really, and so we've been talking about language, and there's obviously, Jack, in the way you're explaining with these sort of poems, kind of random text, I suppose the idea is that there's some meaningfulness comes about in it.
Yeah.
And we were talking before in the panel before about Cern's kind of use, like what use is it in the climate situation we're in, and I wonder about the sort of if it's the role of culture and art in general to sort of provide that sort of, well, just provide like the bottom line of meaning to what's actually happening at Cern, that's not about just sort of theories and uses and use upon use and like where it's going, and maybe art does that. Like, is that its role? And did you feel that that was your role to find meaning?
Well, I mean, you know, I had this interesting conversation at Cern with a physicist called John Ellis, who's a bit of a kind of Cern legend, who's been there for, I don't know, Monica, how long has John Ellis been there for?
His entire life.
His entire life. He's born there. He's actually formed in an experiment. And but he said to me, like, the more that he understands about his work, the more he realizes that there's less meaning to the universe. So, you know, like, meaning is a human construct. You know, there's beyond kind of consciousness, there's just physical stuff following whatever kind of laws it happens to follow. So meaning is, something that only really exists in this realm that we all live in, because, we don't really live in physical reality. Physical reality is a very long way away from what we're kind of in. But I thought that was kind of interesting. And then, so this, I mean, at least with the work that we're showing in this show, it is partly an attempt, it is kind of an experiment to actually, find where the limit is between something being meaningful and being meaningless. Or you could also kind of, if you wanted to, you could view it from a different angle, and it could be the point at which the language and the physical world, meet, and in the end, language, it can become rendered useless in the face of the kind of what the actual physical world is like. Terence McKenna, the psychedelics researcher, once said that he was describing the psychedelic experience, and he said that the trouble with trying to describe it in words is that words fall off it like water off a duck's back. And I think that's true for just, everything that we perceive. It would take an infinite number of words just to describe what's happening right now. So yeah, I think art can explore whatever it wants to, but I think the question of where the edge of meaning lies is a really fertile one. At least it has been for the work that we've been doing.
Can I add something to that? Because I think there's maybe a connection with the question about randomness earlier. I mean, in the neurosciences, the phenomena of what's called apophenic perception is well known. So essentially, I think it touches on maybe what the physicists were talking about, that we're narrating primates that are very good at picking out or making up stories about patterns. Whether those stories are real or not then leads to a question about objectivity, subjectivity, all of that. And I think there's this real issue about how we tend to superpose and project meaning into that which is essentially meaningless in a strictly technical way. I'd be kind of interested to know what the physicists make.
Yeah, I mean, like pattern seeking, its meaning is like an artifact of pattern seeking.
Almost,
in a way.
Yeah, from.
So that's kind of a few things. We've talked about that a number of times. In a way, I guess your question is about who provides meaning, and everyone's looking for meaning. But when you look at the sort of mechanics of looking for meaning, it's almost pattern seeking, and that's the kind of. But then that's an abstraction in itself. So
it also ties to that quote, Jose Carlos, you said at the beginning about Einstein. Was it? I can't remember the exact quote, but it's sort of talking about the kind of why is maths so kind of, it seems quite unreasonable that it's so successful in describing the world. And one of the things that one of the things we did at Cern was talk to a lot of theorists about the kind of role of maths and why does maths work to describe the world, and is it that the world is actually made out of kind of language, mathematics, or is the world just out there being physical stuff and maths is a kind of artifact of it? And through these kind of conversations, I kind of was led to start thinking that actually, we are pattern-seeking beings, and like Seth said, if you live in an ordered world where the sun goes down and then it comes up again, or you drop things and they fall to the floor, then you start kind of spotting this kind of order, and then if you kind of where you can kind of build in some kind of cognitive sense this kind of picture of order. And then you can use the kind of gift of abstraction to actually start turning that into mathematics. Yeah, or, so really it's kind of, but when you view it like that, it stops being so surprising that maths works to describe the universe, because maths is somehow derived from just the fact that there is some order to the universe, at least the universe that we kind of live in day to day, and we can abstract. So it kind of makes sense that, we should then be able to mirror where it came from in the first place using maths.
Nice. I love the fact, Jack, that you changed that Einstein quote from admirable to unreasonable.
Yeah, well, it's actually, there's a famous quote by Eugene Wigner. Eugene Wigner was a scientist, and it's probably Wigner. And he wrote an essay called The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics. So that's, I kind of nicked that.
Okay. Anyone else got a question? I'm going to start thrusting it in your hand if people don't put their hands up. No? Okay. I had a thought whilst we were going through these panels in relation to the idea of this mirror world where 11,000 artists were funded and supported to live in a concrete building somewhere on the border of France and Switzerland to answer the questions of the universe and who we are, occasionally accepting scientists in to explain our ideas with their crazy facts, and just what kind of a world that would be. And maybe this exhibition is some sort of a window into that world. So maybe let's leave it there. Thank you very much to the panel.